I'm with ICSI. I've been here, as you'll see, on and off in various ways, almost since its founding. I'm also on campus, the EECS department, and with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which will play a role in the discussions here. So I'm in networking. I do, in particular, network measurement. I'm an empiricist. And as I took the opportunity to reflect on the last 2 decades that ICSI has spanned, it's just been utterly amazing for networking. And of course, the big story has been the internet. And in fact, there's both been amazing growth and paradigm shifts. And I'm going to illustrate both of those. I'm very much a data guy, and we're going to see a lot of what I think is beautiful data. Now, personally, my work on looking at this beautiful data moved me from just general trying to understand networks to attackers and security. And so I'm going to sketch this progression from doing network measurement to detecting attacks. The attackers start out, they're manual. The person's actually sitting there trying to break into the machine. They become automated. I'll talk a bit about worms. Today's landscape is bots. I'll talk about those somewhat. Bots and spam. And that's all going to lead to selling of the Viagra. So we will get to the Viagra, I promise you. First, though, some thanks. These folks work with me a lot in networking and security. Up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, this work really would not at all have been possible, and I'll explain that in a bit. There have been a number of folks who have been vital. Oh, and I've stolen some slides and beautiful data from these people, too, I should say. Wei-Dong Kui did the work on the Honeyfarm that I'll be talking about. And then we have a really vibrant collaboration with UC San Diego. And in particular, all the Viagra works also with them. OK, so part one. I sometimes reflect on, why have I had the good fortune to do quite well at stuff I like? And some of it, I'm sure, comes out of my temperament, which is I really do want to know what is the bottom line, what's actually the truth. And I'm paranoid. I'm worried that I'm going to get fooled into believing the wrong thing. And this has led me to be an empiricist. I really want to get measurements. I want to see what's the real world say, not what does the theory say. I'm fascinated what the theory predicts, and I'm fascinated when it's right, and I'm fascinated when it's wrong. I like being surprised. So I'm going to lay that out. Now, in the progression here, let's go back to the founding of ICSI, which we heard a bit about. And this is also when the internet's really gaining some steam. So Domenico Ferrari talked about how, for him, ICSI began July 5th, 1985. He knows the exact date. And if we looked at the internet at that time, it had about 1,200 hosts. And the methodology here is looking how many names were in the, at that time, centralized database of all the names of the hosts. And you need to know a host name to talk to it. So the size of that database was the size of the internet. Concurrent and somewhat using the internet, but also using other networking technology, there's this bulletin board system called Usenet. And for now, I just want you to track those numbers. We're going to return to why I'm bothering to tell you how many kilobytes a day we're flowing through this system. All right? So we've got 1,200 internet hosts, 340 kilobytes a day. Now, it takes a little while from this to go into ICSI being incorporated. We have about a year and a half passes. And now the internet is 3,500 hosts. It's gone up by a factor of 3. And the bulletin board system's 800 kilobytes, so a little less than a factor of 3. We get the lease in this building. That's another roughly year and a half, and we have 29,000 internet hosts. And then the official inauguration of ICSI, this was the likely date that Morgan dug up. Now we have 56,000 hosts. This network is really starting to grow. And it's very interesting size already here. My own story starts September 1990. So I'm a grad student at Berkeley, and I enroll in Professor Ferrari's networking course. And it was a special topics course. It was not even a mainstream grad course. And as part of that, I need a course project that's going to turn into my master's project. And I pick network measurement. Not because I had a clue that it was useful, but Van Jacobson at Lawrence Berkeley Lab said, this internet thing's going to be big, and no one's looking at it. So why don't you measure it? So now we have 313,000 hosts. Okay? About a year later, I joined Professor Ferrari's tenant group, working on my PhD now. We have 617,000 hosts. And then my first paper appears in 1994 on growth trends of this system. And we have about 3 million hosts. This thing's just going boom, 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 boom. Let me look at an illustration from that paper. This is data gathered from 1990 to 1994, 7 different month-long data sets. The circles are in proportion to how many bytes did the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab exchange with that geographic region for a data set. And the small circle is what's the minimum we ever saw, and the large is what's the largest over those 7 data sets. Now, what I think really striking here is a couple things. One is way back in early 90s, we have enormous geographic diversity. In fact, there were 69 countries known to be connected to the internet at that time, and the laboratory talked with 65 of them. The other thing is the incredible dynamic range of some of these areas, right? This is its minimum, that's its maximum. Look at Mexico here, very tiny, big. Spain over here. You can't really point to what is the right pattern, what's typical. It's quite dynamic. It changes a great deal. And this theme just echoes throughout the internet and all sorts of facets of it. In the paper, I like these quotes. One of them is this relatively new information retrieval protocols, Gopher and no the yet, and World Wide Web. And they really were taken off. And commercial use of the network was taking off. Very exciting time. OK, now, let me go to that bulletin board system that I've been shadowing. Here's data. Now, I love longitudinal data. It's so hard to get. And it's so fascinating when you have it for something that's as dynamic as the internet. So what this is I got this data set. And it's how many bytes per day were going through that bulletin board system, all the way back to late '84. So here we have a decade. And it's kind of a hard, who knows what's going on here, but clearly it really got pretty exciting there. Now, as a data analysis person, you see something like that, and you say, well, what's it like on a log linear plot? And here it is. So now, instead of this being linear scale, it's log scaled. Same exact data. And on a log linear plot, a straight line is exponential growth. And in fact, you can, you just read the growth off the fit of the line. This is 80% a year. Oh, and these are holidays. So every December, it falls off. Okay. It's really, really striking. I mean, for one, that's a beautiful fit. For real data, man, it's just sitting on that line. All right? Obviously, it's going to have some noise in it. A decade. We're looking at a decade here. And that coefficient doesn't change. This is one of the puzzles. I don't know why it doesn't change. Intuitively, sure, it grows fast. But why is it 80% a year? And why does it just sustain that for a decade? Now, I got this data from Rick Adams, who founded a little company called UUNet. And right around here, Rick's potential wealth was exploding. And he had better things to do with managing his company than run this script. And the script broke at that point because of the volume started to wrap some counters. So I lost the data. And I lament it because there's this intriguing little, it's kind of going up. 2 years later, I was able to get data from a guy who was sure it was the exact same methodology. Very important. And I want to know, OK, how'd the trend go there? And those were his points. He got me 2 points, way up there. Now, one thing you kind of think growth like that's got to tail off. Did the opposite. This was really striking. We had a decade-long invariant. And in fact, because the network is so complex and changing in so many ways, anytime we find something that doesn't change, it's gold. Right? It's a way to actually think about it, this incredibly dynamic thing, and build up a mental model. And so I had this really nice mental model, the 80% growth, and it got trashed there. and in the surprising direction, the one I wouldn't have predicted. Now, to analyze this, there's this nasty problem of, is it the same data? You know, is it the methodology really the same? Maybe he just recorded it differently. Now, both data sets not only had bytes per day, but articles per day. You know, and so here's the articles per day. And it has the same, you know, falls off on Christmas. The growth is a little lower, 75%. But the new points pretty much sit on the line. So that was an interesting consistency check across these. This is as good as it's going to get, right? I mean, I'm not going to be able to go to the billionaire at this point and say, could you really dig up those scripts and make sure this is the equivalent methodology? I'm not going to be able to do that. But this is quite good. And then what does it imply? Well, I mean, it has an obvious implication, which is the size of articles, the average size, went way up. Okay? That's how you get a whole lot more bytes, same number of articles. Why does it go up? Because we're now in the era of abuse. In particular, I thought, well, it goes up, all right, really big articles in this bulletin board system, pornography. That turns out to be a quarter to a third of it. Most of it, in fact, was stolen software. It's called wares. Okay? So people would ship around binaries for these programs, and the binaries are big, and they did a lot and a lot of it. So all the way back in, you know, 96, we've got blatant piracy going on, enough to throw off a 10-year trend. Okay, so now internet abuse. Now, of course, the network's been misused by people, you know, since the word day one or whatever, the word go, but not sort of as a phenomena that occurred broadly enough that you paid attention to it. It's sort of something you fixed as a one-off. We had the Morris worm in '88, which was very exciting. Now it becomes part of the lay of the land. So what had happened is I'm up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, still doing my PhD at Domenico, and the operators more and more often would come to me and say, you know, we've had this problem of abuse of some sort. Someone tried to break in or the like. Does your data that you're capturing happen to cover that time period? Because that would help with the forensics, understand what really happened. Was the incident really a problem or not? And this was intriguing, because it would sometimes, and got me thinking about, well, gee, what if we build a system to do this all the time? That led to the BRO intrusion detection system, a real-time system that watches network traffic and is trying to understand what's going on in it. Does it reflect a problem? And we use this system all the way through today. In fact, just put out a new release of it today. This has been a fascinating project. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. And it has been running up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So let me sketch the lab for you so you have it in your head. Today, it is about 2,500 staff and 1,500 associated people in various forms, 8,000 computers, 10 gigabit per second connectivity. So it's a big institute. It's a lot bigger than ICSI. We run this at ICSI too. But you know, it runs at the lab, and it's been running continuously since then because it's part of their operational cybersecurity. So it's watching traffic crossing into the lab and going out, and now it watches inside it as well. And it knows, you know, who's talking to whom and what application they're using and the like. There's a bunch of interesting technical stuff here that I'm not going to go into due to time about this really hard problem. What's the semantics of what you're seeing? Not just what's the pattern, but what does it mean? And that has different layers of understanding that get increasingly hard to tackle, and it's something we continue to push on. So we do a lot of work on that. I'm going to just put that aside. Now, what did this detection problem look like? So now we've transitioned away from just network measurement, and we're in the world of, we got to deal with these guys. What does it look like? And it changes a lot. So let's start with, in the mid-90s, we're running this thing. And where did the system get a lot of its detective power? Well, we'd look at sensitive objects and see, well, who accesses them and in what context. So, you know, some hosts would be sensitive and they shouldn't be connected to you externally, except in certain ways. Some usernames are sensitive. This LP was the default line printer account on Silicon Graphics machines and happen to be fully privileged and have a known password. So you could just log into any Silicon Graphics machine and completely control it. Root with zeros there is attacker weenies for when you've compromised a machine and you want to set up your account to come back to, rather than root ROOT, which is the standard Unix privileged account, they use the zeros. Some file names are sensitive, some services. Okay, so this access to this is certainly of interest. There are some types of abusive protocols. For example, the file transfer protocol has a little command in it that says, "Oh, please run a command locally on my behalf." You know, very ripe for abuse. Overflows of the finger service to locate users, stuff like that. The real, so this was good. That you know got us on protective power. But the real detection, the stuff that kept saving us from various incidents, was looking at behavior. How are systems behaving? There would be certain indications that you definitely have a problem. One of these is one of the local servers starts running a chat relay. Okay? This sounds weird. I'll get back to it in a minute. In other words, we'd see outbound requests to a site like uberhaxer.net or anticode.com. The lab staff tends not to go to those sites. But when someone has broken into a machine, they will go there to download tools to help them secure their footing on the machine. And then we'd look inside, what are people typing? Because at that time, most of the traffic was in the clear. And there were certain things, if you typed it, boy, you were very likely a bad guy and not a benign user. And my favorite, and this still works, when we've gotten modern encrypted sessions, we've gotten the decrypted version, you still see this. The first thing a lot of attackers do is turn off history. Okay, and legit users almost never do this. So you see that in a session, man, you probably have a problem. It's got nothing to do with how they got in. Everything to do with the fact that, yeah, they're really there. Behavior. There are others, like if you see this string, it's someone typing in code, a particular code segment for a buffer overflow attack to try to escalate their privileges. So we're now in this era where the attackers are manually exploiting things. And they have several traits. The first is they're in it mostly to first for bragging, vandalism. And that's why they set up the chat server, because they want to talk with their buddies and say, woohoo, look, I'm at a .gov. Okay, that would be often their motivation. The community, oh, and all these themes are going to sort of continue in various forms, all right? This one's going to continue in the fact that it's going to morph. That's not going to be their motivation in the future. Community reuse of tools. Okay, they go to these sites, these handy sites, and we could find that you very likely were an attacker if this text literally occurred in one of your login sessions, smurf.c by tfreak, or another one, coded by James Setter. And that's because there was so much reuse of exploit tools that when an attacker is reusing it, they use some original source that keeps getting modified, and in it they've got credits for who wrote the original, and they never remove that. So if you see, coded by James Setter, you knew, oh yeah, that's one of the long lineage of exploit things that derive from the code that James thoughtfully put his name in. This is also going to morph. This is going to get worse, as I'll talk near the end of the talk. Finally, they start using automated systems to manage their exploits, bots. So that's what this egg drop is. It's an automated system at the time, and it was just for chat. It was no big deal. This is going to come back to haunt us in spades in another decade. All right, so it's all the precursors are there. Now, there's a, I think, quite valid thing you might be wondering, which is, these are weenies. Who cares about weenies? What about the serious attackers? What about the guys out there trying to steal national secrets, which the lab doesn't have, but often it gets confused with Lawrence Livermore, which does. Why does this matter? And this, I think, is the first really interesting departure from how academia views a problem and how the real world does. So let me illustrate this. this notion of threat model. So in academia, back then, this has changed, but in the 90s in particular, a lot of computer security work came out of cryptography. That was just its genesis. I didn't. I came into it from networking, and it was quite striking how the two different lineages really knew nothing about each other, nothing at all, which meant there was a lot of opportunity if you could bridge. So in cryptography, by golly, you prove how well your thing works. And you have a model of your adversary, and your model generally is it's a pretty fearsome adversary. They know your algorithms, they know your deployment, there's this amount of information they don't know, your crypto key, and you derive all your math from that. Okay, so it's this notion of rigor of security. And that's just very different from how it goes down in practice. In practice, instead, you're managing your site, your network, whatever, and you've got limited resources, and you've got to trade them off. You're trying to manage risk, trying to allocate resource, and there's no proofs at all. You're just trying to gauge how bad is it. That notion of what are you really defending against is your threat model. Okay? Now, cryptographers have it too, but they have it in these abstract adversaries. And in practical security, you've got some often very nitty-gritty things that you've sort of prioritized. And it can be pretty different than what you expect. So I want to illustrate this because I find this really a nice illustration. Lawrence Berkeley Labs is part of the Department of Energy. Department of Energy is full of procedures and the like, of course, like any bureaucracy. Here's its manual on safeguards and security program planning and management. Okay, big fat document that tells you what you got to worry about, et cetera. And part of it, the part that's interesting here for understanding the Department of Energy's threat model, is reportable categories of incidents of security concern. When something bad happens, security related, how much time do you get before you have to tell the Washington about the problem? All right? So we can literally read off what are their priorities here. And for example, you lose your security badges that you issued, more than 5% of them. So you issued 100 of them, and more than 5 are gone over the past year. You have to report every month. That one already kind of worries me. I mean, you would think a security badge, you shouldn't lose. And if you lose less than 5%, you don't even have to report it, presumably. A system gets broken into with root privilege. 8 hours. Okay, so it's pretty significant. You have a nuclear weapon that's stolen or otherwise diverted. They think of everything here, right? All right. So you lose a nuke, you get an hour. Right? You got to get your story together. That's clear, and then you get an hour. Now, what the follow-on to this is back here we go 2 years ago. This memo for all the associate directors and site office managers from the acting chief operating officer or office assignment, blah 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 blah. And this memo is about personally identifiable information. Like a mother's maiden name, and the name it goes with is covered here. All right? Driver's license number would be, and so forth. You get 45 minutes to report that being stolen. You get less time than the stolen nuke. Right? So you picture the phone call. You call up and say, I told you about that driver's license 15 minutes ago. Well, it actually was part of, a nuclear weapon was associated with that. Why this incredible disparity? And it's because, what is their real threat model? The threat model of these managers is getting fired. And how do they get fired? They piss off Congress. Now, shortly before this memo went out, the Veteran Affairs Bureau did lose a bunch of personally identifiable information, and people did lose their jobs. Their heads rolled. So by golly, it's not going to happen. Now, this is similar to why does the lab care about these weenie attackers? Because for Lawrence Berkeley Lab, one of its biggest threats is bad publicity. It can cost the lab tens of millions of dollars to have an embarrassing newspaper article that Congress then says, what are those bozos in Berkeley doing, blah, 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 blah. So it really does matter to take care of it. It's about perception. It's a rational decision process. It's not the one you think of in the ivory tower. Okay? Now, they care about other things. You know, they don't want to lose the nukes or whatever. But you know, the priorities there are different. And what this nicely illustrates is that as we've been conducting this research, we've done it now for a long time, and we've done it tied to operations, and it's just transformative to how we pursue the problems. And that means it's research gold, because it means that we are able to tackle some of these issues in a way that is just not possible if you don't have such an environment. If you're working in isolation in your lab, you just don't see the problems the same. Okay, so I'm going to just go through a few ways that that's the case. One of them, obviously, is this whole notion of what really are the policies, what really matters, where's the emphasis and the like. Performance is another. This is a pretty, obvious one. So when we were running at that up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, or we run on UC campus, there's a lot of traffic. I mean, it's really pushing on performance. So it's something that might work just fine inside our departmental LAN or here at ICSI. Won't at all scale just performance-wise. So our current target is we need to go to speeds where we have 10 microseconds, less than 10 microseconds per packet. And we're not just counting the packet or something. We're actually parsing. We're putting it in its sequence, and we're parsing the result. And then we are executing a bunch of analyses that work on the parsed form, et cetera. So there's a strong pressure on performance there. And we've done research on this in the past in terms of clusters and FPGA front ends. And now we're working on multi-core architecture. So that one's pretty clear about how it's different doing it operationally. This one you never appreciate until you actually do it, which is diversity. It's about when you have a large body of users, a large amount of connections and so forth, you just see the darndest stuff in there. It's pretty rare or whatever, but it's there. And it means that you will see all sorts of broken applications or things that are just operating that's completely counter to the spec, but it happens to work, so there it is. What this does is it undermines your ability to build up a notion of, profile what's normal and flag deviations from it as attacks. This is a whole class of intrusion detection based on anomaly detection, it's called, where you're going to flag deviations from the norm. And the reality is, the norm, the true norm, is much wider in many ways than you might think. So there's an incredible premium on finding sharp distinguishing features between true normal and adversaries versus sort of statistical ones. So the ones I showed you earlier, the behavioral ones, those have a lot of power. Now they may not have power in all contexts. They may be somewhere else. People do, go to uberhaxer.net to download stuff. I don't know why, but we found, in our environment, it works great. And we know in a lot of other environments it works great. So you can be led completely astray if you don't understand this diversity problem. And looking at your departmental, network and analyzing it, you're not going to see it. You're not going to see enough junk. There's also a deep problem here with evasion. And I really don't have time to sketch this thoroughly, but it turns out, due to quite subtle properties of when you analyze network traffic, you don't really know how the end systems are treating the traffic. It turns out this is a toehold for attackers to confuse you in a pretty fundamental way. If you didn't have this problem of all this crud out there, you can tell it's confusing. You can look and say, oh, gee, this just doesn't add up. Because of the crud, you cannot take action on seeing it. If you see one of these peculiarities that might mean the attacker is confusing you, very often, no, it just means something out there is behaving quite strangely. To give a sense of this crud, the Bro system at ICSI, which is not all that big, logs about 10,000 different weird things a day. Finally, there's what's called the base rate fallacy. And I'm not going to give you the full definition of it. I'll just sketch the notion. It's not that hard. Suppose you've got a detector, and it makes a mistake of saying something's bad when it's not, only one time in a million. If you run that at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, it's going to go off 10 times a day because there's 10 million connections going through there. And if you run this per connection, you're running a huge number of events. If the thing you're targeting is quite rare, which a lot of break-ins might be, depending on the type of break-in, you will much more often, it will go off falsely, even though it's incredibly accurate. Right? So this is really a tough one. And it's also unappreciated if you work in a small environment, because in a small environment, you never run 10 million events through the thing. And you might not have it in part of your mental model that indeed will be the case. There will be 10 million connections a day, and 1 in a million is not good enough. What do these cost? It depends, right? They might cost little if you're able to sort of ignore them, or they might cost a lot. In particular, they cost analyst time, which is another thing you don't always appreciate working in the ivory tower, is the analysts, they don't like tracking down things that turn out to be bogus if it happens over and over and over. They will just tend to ignore the whole thing. And then your detector does nothing. Now, we started off watching this traffic, analyzing it. That was very effective to be able to, in real time, say, whoops, there's probably a problem here. And then that moved as the operators at the laboratory got confidence in it. They enabled the system to automatically block. This is a very high bar. I don't know of other research system that does that, in fact. So the system is able, at the border of the lab, and the lab lives and dies off its connectivity. It's really quite important to the laboratory's mission. The system is enabled to, by itself, decide, I'm going to terminate this connectivity to this remote internet host. It goes off and does it. So now we really, these screw-ups can get expensive. It's really pushed on the research. This has been a real boon. And in fact, for a while, we could measure, and the boon in particular is there's various things that will get blocked. The number one thing is scanners, remote hosts looking for vulnerable local systems. All right, and they'll just look, and eventually they'll find one. And if you don't block them, they will find it and break in, and you have a problem. So the number one use for the prevention has been to block these scanners. For a while, we could even have a measure, and I wish I took the data, but I didn't, which was how many hours after the system would fail, and it would fail now and then, would the lab have a compromised machine. And at one point, it dropped down to about 4 hours. Okay? The system's off for whatever reason. 4 hours later, there's a break. So let me talk about these scanners. Here's another nice bit of longitudinal data. So a side effect, a Benny, of running up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab for security monitoring is, of course, I squirrel away all the data. So we have every connection in and out of the lab going back to the early 90s. This is, at the laboratory, how many connections each day was the lab engaged in. 1997 up to about 2003. And we've just plot every single day. These are weekends, all right, falls. And again, this really nicely sits on a line. It's a little noisier than the other one, okay. The other one was actually aggregated every 2 weeks. This is every single day. A line, it's growing 55% a year. Another exponential, different thing, and the other one was articles in a bulletin board system. This is connections at a single site. And what's interesting is then this, all right, so again, we've got years and years of steady growth, and then we get paradigm shift, okay? So here, boom, the connections explodes. It goes from 55% a year to almost 600% a year growth. Game changed. How did it change? I'm sorry?
What happened to the weekend? Why are people working on the weekend?
Oh, good. In fact, what's driving this so high is not people. And they don't take the weekend off. Machines don't care about weekends. So here is scans per day, another longitudinal data set, starting in 1994. And we count how many different remote hosts scanned the laboratory that day. And I'm putting aside here the difficulty of a crisp definition of scan. We've done some work on justifying this definition. I believe it's really quite a good one. And so we go along for, what do we got? Almost 8 years, and it's between, well, some days very few, and on the average, maybe 50 or something different hosts scanning us. And then it literally changes overnight, July 19th, 2001, and we enter this world. Completely different. I should emphasize log scaled. All right, so here 100, here 10,000 to 100,000, and boom, we've got a paradigm shift right there. What is the shift? It is the worm era. Began that day. We know the day. In fact, we kind of know the hour. And then, so this next plot, this is from July 19th, 2001. This is recorded up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And this is how many systems we have not seen earlier in the day each minute arrive trying to connect to our web servers. Okay? So new hosts per minute. And we're going along, and sure, there's a new host, et cetera. And right around 6:30, 7 a.m. Pacific time, we experience this remarkable rise. And keep in mind, it's new. It's not sort of integrated. It's new. So here at the peak, every minute we're seeing 1,500 hosts we'd never heard from that day. New ones coming. Goes up, and then it starts falling down. And this, in fact, is because, and as we'll get to in a minute, this worm is starting to saturate. It's having trouble finding new victims. Okay? The worm starts to saturate. These are measurement outages. And here, this worm had this bizarre behavior that it entirely globally died at 5 o'clock due to a bug. And I'd love to go into that, but there's too much else to cover here. So what are these worms? So if you break into a system, and you might not be you, a human typing, it might be you running a program that automatically is finding a system to break into, you can tell it to do whatever you want. That's sort of the definition of compromising a machine. And one thing you can tell it to do, if you're an automated program doing this, is, hey, why don't you also start running me on my behalf? And so the process that has broken into the system now has a sister process also running. So these are processes that are self-replicating across the network. One way they can spread is they just pick random 32-bit numbers. The internet, every host with connectivity in the internet is addressable by a 32-bit number. Pick one at random, maybe there's a host there. Might not be vulnerable to what you're exploiting, so you might have to pick quite a few numbers, but eventually you're going to find one. When you do, if it hasn't already been compromised, now it is, and you've just increased a number of processes out there that are all probing the network. Work in parallel. So these things grow exponentially fast until they saturate. That one, code red, 369,000 hosts, 10 hours. This is the first one, and sort of changes the landscape, but there are improvements that come. I'm leaving out several, but some milestones. Blaster comes 2 years later, gets 9 million over 9 days. A lot bigger. It was designed poorly. Oh boy. Gets 25 million total, even though it's really quite inefficient. Slammer, same year, gets 75,000, small, but in 10 minutes, really fast. And this is a problem we start working on. We find this really fascinating. It's not our sort of mainstream stuff we've been doing, detecting attacks. Now we're thinking about this global event that happens, and it potentially happens very quickly. And so we start thinking, well, could it be worse? Nick Weaver here in particular is an incredibly devious mind for making them worse. And so we have a paper design, untested, that would get 1 million in 2 seconds. And you'd only really know if that's true if you did it, but we don't plan to. And we have another that does 50 to 150 billion damage in a day. This one was interesting. This was, we were essentially commissioned by DARPA to say, how bad is the threat? And we tried to come up with a conservative, defendable number, and that's what we got. Yeah?
Was there something that stopped Slammer after 10 minutes?
Couldn't hear that.
Was there something that stopped Slammer after 10 minutes?
No, it got every victim was infected.
It ran out of victims.
Yep. And then it kept spraying around for quite a while. Turned out it's easy to filter out Slammer inside the network, and so everybody individually rolled out these filters. You can design worms that are not easy to filter. That one was easy. Okay, so let me go a bit into how we might detect such an outbreak with very high accuracy very quickly. All right, because this is something we focused on for quite a while here. And we did it in the context of CSI. This is a NSF Cyber Trust Center. And CSI is Collaborative Center for Internet Epidemiology and Defenses. This is joint with UC San Diego. It's been our sort of, #1 effort here for the last almost 5 years, the center. So how do we quickly detect them? Well, the worms out there are busy probing, and we're just going to focus on one type. So those of you who know the details here, yeah, okay, this is a subset of the problem. The worms out there are picking these random addresses to try to get to, and what if a whole lot of those addresses belong to us? Not just one, like your typical system, but we have a what's called network telescope. We have a big chunk of addresses, and they all come to us. All right, so this is going to be the idea. Very early in the spread, while this indiscriminate probing is going on, some of it's going to come our way. Now, what do we do with that? We build what we call a Honeyfarm. So the idea here is we're going to funnel all that traffic to honeypot systems. And a honeypot system is a system that has no role, actual production role, and therefore whatever happens to it shouldn't be happening. That's the way you think about it. And while sometimes something happens to it by mistake, somebody accidentally selects that machine, very often in today's internet it happens due to malice. Some attacker has found the machine and is going to try to break into it. And the point of having honeypots is to then see that this malicious activity is going on and study it. So we want to do this, and we were able to get a telescope here in Berkeley of about 250,000 internet addresses, which means in any global outbreak, any sort of indiscriminate scanning thing, very, very early on, it's going to trip off one of these addresses. So here's how the system looks. Internet's out there where all the source of badness is, and we have advertised what's called dark space. That's our telescope saying, oh yeah, all those addresses, they happen to be here in Berkeley. Some probe comes from the internet and via our dark space to routers that are going to direct it to the front end of our honey farm. In our honey farm, we've got a bunch of physical machines, and they are running Windows. And they're running Windows mostly in virtual machines. All right, so picture, we've got several dozen Windows systems here. Surely we don't want 250,000, right? I mean, that would defeat the whole purpose. We're trying to scale fairly modest detection resources up to that 250,000 figure. All right, so we have a few of these running, and this probe is coming from the internet, and the gateway now is going to, and we're going to do the simple case, which is this is the worm we want to detect. There's a whole separate set of problems of junk that isn't interesting. So the gateway is going to pick one of these Windows systems running in the virtual machine and forward the network traffic to it. Say, why don't you talk with that probe? And we just let this go on. We mediate this. Maybe at some point, our system here decides to initiate its own internet connection. There are several reasons why it might do that. It might just have to look up some resource, for example. Or it might be trying to spread the worm, which is what we're going after. Remember, the goal here is very quickly tell that there's a global outbreak with very high probability. So here's the nice trick. This connection comes, and what we do is we reflect it back to a different honeypot system. We don't know the semantics of any of this. We don't know necessarily. Now, obviously, for other reasons, we'll want to analyze that. But for this detector, we don't know how the exploit works, what service it's going after. All we need is that the service is indeed running here. We don't know what the meaning of this is, but we bounce it back into the Honeyfarm. And now, if that second system tries to make an attack, then we have seen a process propagate from here to here. Because it's a honeypot, it doesn't do anything unless it's made to do it externally. So here we have a exploit agnostic, incredibly high accuracy detector for a worm propagating, which is we've seen network traffic cause activity across machines, sort of the definition of a worm. And we could do it really quickly because we have a big telescope. That was what we worked on a whole bunch. That was Wei Dong's thesis. We got 66 different types of worms with it. And now all right, so keep that in mind.
But how do you keep the bad guys from avoiding it?
Oh, there's a ton of issues like that, and I'm not going to have time to go into it. Yeah. OK, so the worm era begins. Let's go back to this. It's followed by what I would call the onset of aggressive automated tools. So these are tools that are scanning the network, not necessarily to spread worms, okay? But it's a change, it's a sea change. We've gone from the manual attackers, or those just a few manually employing scanners, to heavily automated attacks. We get at about this point in late 2004, 5-year funding to fight the threat of worms. At the same time, the worm era ends. I mean, boy, we hit this just so perfectly, okay? Now, luckily, we framed our center more broadly. And what the worm era ends means that that's the last of the really big worms, the seismic worms. They're still spreading and so forth, but they're peanuts. And what arises is botnets. Okay, so this is where we now shift gears to part 2, how we wound up selling Viagra. Now, so the landscape of the last 5 years has been very different than going back to the mid-90s, where we've got the guys bragging and downloading the free tools and so forth. This is a tool you can buy that is for customizing your break-in on a machine. Okay, so you can say, what do you want to do when you have compromised the machine? Do you want to send out CD-ROM keys so you can pirate software? Do you want the person's address book? Do you want the URLs from their web surfing? Do you want to turn off antivirus? Why that's an option, I don't know. Do you want to trash the server when you install it and so forth? This is 2005. And what's striking is this is a company. And in fact, they have customer support. So when you buy this, you get a shrink-wrapped manual. And you can go to them with problems, and they'll fix it. Here's a different take on the theme I'm building here. This is a site in Russian, and it sells eBay accounts, real ones. And they sell depending on how many favorable approvals, how many favorable ratings the account has. Okay? So this is a service selling access to stolen accounts, clearly for purposes of fraud, right? That's why you care. What's its reputation? Here's a different one. These guys sell social networking bots. So these are software packages you can use to create zillions of MySpace, Facebook accounts, and the like. Why do you want that? Well, you want that because you want to send spam through MySpace and Facebook's mail system, internal mail system. And you need a lot of accounts for it because they're going to all sort of friend each other and make it look like it's a real set of people. Otherwise, MySpace will just filter out the spam attempts. Now, what's interesting here is, they've just integrated CAPTCHA bypasser, right? CAPTCHAs are the hard-to-read words that you'll get interacting with the web, which is some servers attempt to say, are you really a person or are you a bot? So they've integrated a bypasser. You can become an affiliate. Why don't you sell this stuff too? Yeah, get your cut of the sweetness. This is getting sophisticated. And then look at this, that asterisk. If you go all the way down, there's tons of stuff. This is just the first 5 of maybe 80 products that you can buy. That asterisk says the CAPTCHA bypasser. In fact, you need to go to this CAPTCHA busting service and contract with them. And what they're selling you is the glue for that interconnection. All right? So picture how specialization is emerging here. And you can make a ton of money doing nothing directly illegal. Right? I mean, is this stuff illegal? No. Using it at least violates terms of service, certainly. This is a study we did of an underground market where goods and services are exchanged between crooks. We were able to get transcripts from it. And, you know, so this is a summary of the ads. I want a login to a bank account. Duh, who doesn't? I want credit cards. Oh, sorry, this person's selling it. I want credit cards, I want PayPal accounts, and it goes on and on and on and on. I'm selling scam pages. You know, if you want to set up a phishing site, well, I've got the toolkit for you. You know, and a huge amount of commerce, and there are also a bunch of services. Cashier. I can take money from, say, a PayPal account and turn it into real money that's not going to get traced to you. Now, currently, you take about half of it for doing it. There's another form of this where you take physically delivered packages, which have been bought with stolen credit cards, and you just remail them. All right, so it's a form of laundering, and there's all these services one can get. So the point here is that this underground economy has arisen, and it's no longer the guys who want to chat on Internet Relay Chat about, woohoo, I got LBL.gov. It's about people who want money. The backbone of all this is the incredible ease of getting bots, which are compromised machines. It's the follow-on to Worms. Worms got tons of machines, used them to get even more machines. Bots get tons of machines and now just use the machines. It's general purpose computers that might send out spam, they might eavesdrop on what the user's doing, they might rummage through their files, get their address books for more spam, etc. A lot of the monetization of bots revolves around spam. So now here's my last longitudinal data set. This is, Mark Allman is director of ICSI's campus in Ohio, and also a measurement guy like me. And he, you know, has the same thirst for longitudinal data. He's tracked his email since 2002, every piece of it, whether it was legit or spam, as determined by a Bayesian classifier. And so this is Mark's non-spam email load over 6 years. And if you fit a least squares fit, there's a slight increase. It's slightly going up. But he's doing, you know, around 200 on a work day, and weekends are friendlier. And here's his spam load, which, you know, is really quite manageable up to about 2005, which is when I think of this era as having started, and then got pretty crazy, and a number of these are clipped. Here's the same data, but what proportion of his mail is spam? And again, in 2004, it was down to 10% or so, and then it just took off, and now it's, of course, heavily spam. Yeah, we all know this phenomenon. The numbers will be a little different. But then again, I love having data to back up. OK, so how profitable is this? This is the key question. How much money do you make? And if you go to the trade press, the Stormworm, which is really, it's really a big botnet, is making millions a day. This is the claim, and it comes from IBM's principal web security strategist. Okay, so millions a day, wow. Where does the money come from, right? There's costs and there's profits. So you've got some cost to send everything, and you've got some profit. And the key thing that's been missing in this assessment, we know what they're selling often, so we can tell if someone buys what it's going to get them. And we have a rough notion of what it costs to send spam, but we have no idea of how profitable it is, how much of the spam gets someone to actually come. What's the conversion rate? How much spam do you have to send to get a response? This is what we set out to measure. Now, Storm spreads just by sending out these stupid e-cards, we call them, that say, you've got a postcard. Who here has not gotten a postcard spam, I'm wondering? You know? Well, maybe you don't all poke through your spam folder like I do. But you'll get this. It says, you know, Hallmark greeting cards, stuff like that. And if you go and follow it to get your card, you'll see a page like this that says, click here to get infected. Well, it doesn't say that. But that's what will happen. And in fact, often, depending on your browser settings, you just have to wait 5 seconds and you get infected. And this is how Storm spreads. It just spews these things out using spam. Once you read spam from Storm, some of it looks like this. It'll point you to a site. This is the exact site. And what are they doing? They're selling stuff. In particular, they're selling Viagra and things like it. Surely everyone has noticed now and then you get Viagra spam. So, and this stuff is not so cheap. $225 for a Viagra. I have no idea what Viagra Professional is. Yeah? I almost want to buy it just to know. All right, so this is what they're selling. You know, and you know, look at those, you know, very forthright-looking folk. On the other hand, this is Kirill Levchenko, who's a PhD student who worked as an integral part of the project we did to measure how many spams you have to send to get someone to come and buy Viagra. So how do we do it? It's really easy to get a Storm, to start running a Storm bot, because Storm spews out spam, and all you got to do is follow and click on the stupid card, and you've got a bot. We run them in GQ in that controlled environment we built for worms. Now we repurpose it for controlled execution of bots. Storm uses some of its bots to forward commands to a lot more bots. That's its structure, it proxies. A lot of work enabled reverse engineering that protocol. Now we know how those commands actually are sent. This lets us watch all the spam that goes through our bot, which is going to run as one of these proxies. So it can study how much spam is sent. And then, in fact, we know now how to change the spam directives that are going through us. We can rewrite them. So this is how it looks. We are running these proxies. The bot controller is going to send out commands to their bots to mail out all this spam. We modify it just slightly. We change the URLs in it. Rather than going to that Canadian site, it goes to a mirror of it that we run, and we've removed the malware from it as a courtesy to our customers. The bots send out a ton of spam. And some of this goes to accounts under our control, so we can measure, okay, how much do they actually deliver? And the bots, you know, it's nice of them. They actually report back and say, this is how well I did. But this lets us calibrate that. And then some user who responds to the spam will come to our server, and we can monitor them there. Okay, this is how now we're going to figure out how profitable is it. Because we know how much of this went out, how much of it should come here if people respond to it, and how many actually come. And we can do demographics on, well, where do they come from and the like. So we did this earlier this year, and 350 million Viagra spams went through our rewriting process. That's the main one I'll talk about. We also did some of these cards, you know, the postcard things for infecting you. We did about 120 million of those. And this is sort of the bottom line. This is the last point I'm going to develop in the talk. What is you could picture this pipeline. You inject all this stuff here. That's the spam. And it gets winnowed down due to various effects. Maybe it never even got delivered. Maybe the spam filter caught it. The user never saw it. Maybe the user didn't care for it. Maybe the user actually comes to the site but doesn't buy. Or they buy. Right? And then there's this top one, crawler, which is, in fact, we had to deal with the reality that there are companies out there that are mining spam for just such URLs and will come and interact with our site. And we had to identify them and keep them separate from humans. So here's the pipeline. We send out 350 million pharmacy spams. Less than a quarter get delivered. So 3/4 of them get gunned down as the bot is trying to make the email connection. This is the efficacy of today's blacklisting. All right? So lots of sites run blacklisting, and a bunch of spam doesn't get through. The next question we can't really answer, and we would love to answer it. How effective were the spam filters? We know it for particular sites. Part of our test accounts were at Hotmail and Gmail and so forth, and so we know how much of our volume went, that we actually received. It was very low at the big email providers. We actually found out later that one of them had spotted us as having a test account, because the actual botmasters do this and treated us differently than they normally would. So next time we do this, we're going to work in concert with them so they don't filter like that. So we aren't able to make this inference, but we do know how many came to the site. 350 million, 10,000 come to the site. How many buy? Right? That's the money question. 28. All that spam, 28 come and buy. So we get one purchase out of 12.5 million spams. Now, it's a little more, they're more likely to click on the postcards. So you get out of, about 250,000 spams will get you one new bot. But it takes 12.5 million to get a purchase off the pharmacy. And what does that mean in terms of money? Well, our entire setup, the average sale, so the way our site worked is you put stuff in your shopping cart. When you clicked on proceed to checkout, that was it, you're gone. Right? So there's nothing happened at that point, because we certainly did not want to take people's identifying information or credit card numbers. That would not be good. So when they clicked, on average, they had about $100 worth of stuff in their shopping cart, which means we would have cleared about $2,700 bucks. Now, we are not interposing on the whole thing. In fact, we definitely don't want to do that. The botmaster is going to notice that. And our estimate is we interposed on about 1.5% of it. So the entire thing could clear $9,500 a day in sales, or 3.5 million a year, not millions a day like the earlier one. Furthermore, generally, that website, all sorts of bad spam points to exactly that website, because it is not run by the person sending the spam. They are affiliates. They are getting a cut of purchases based on having redirected the buyer there, and you get about 40%. So this whole operation might net on the order of a couple million a year. It's not peanuts, but it is not huge. Finally, we looked at, well, is the botmaster the same as the spammer? Or is the botmaster leasing out this service? And this is, we can't directly answer, but here's a strong argument, they're the same person. On the retail market, spam costs about $80 per million to send. So if you just do the math, getting that $9,500 a day would cost about $95,000 a day. So it's not profitable. Therefore, they're almost for sure an integrated operation. They're using their own botnet to make money. Okay, let me summarize the talk here. So, yeah.
That assumes that that $100 is what's gotten, and not, say, the personal information that you didn't want to collect.
Oh, could be. Right. Right. Could be. But the fact that it's an affiliate program, you're getting the redirection. It's not clear you're going to actually get the personal information. So anyway, so that's an enormous amount of change over the past 2 decades here. Network security has gone from not being a field, no conferences, nothing, to we've got these amateurs we're dealing with, to we got these global worms that seem like the sky's falling, to this underground economy. This ardent amateurs, that was pretty easy. It was fun, because you could really have an impact as a researcher. The global worm was sobering. It seemed incredibly hard, and the field collectively made more progress than I remember thinking we could possibly make early on. So that was interesting. It has receded because it's not the profitable way to use these exploits. It looms still for cyber warfare. We're going to see these when nations start attacking each other. And now we're with this third phase, the underground economy. This one is really worrisome because of the specialization and the efficiency that markets produce. There's now a feeling in the research field that it's getting away from us. It's evolving too fast compared to what resources a researcher can bring to the problem space. So on that happy thought, I will take any final questions. I know we're low on time here.
Yeah, and probably should really be using this. But first, let's thank Vern. Any more questions for Vern? Ask them all.
Did the for the pharmacy site, were they actually sending out the Viagra, or was this solely just to collect the cash?
Oh, that's its own interesting question, right? What happens when you buy? They do tend to ship you something. There have been studies that we're trying to understand how well-rounded they are about the quality of what you get. So I've seen studies claiming you sometimes get placebos, you sometimes get counterfeit Viagra that's chemically, it's the same core chemical, different components, and that's all I know. Oh, just a bit of eye candy. The one longitudinal data set I wasn't able to put up there.
So based on your analysis of the thinning out of the what gets through, what would be the most effective choke point to further drive down the efficiency of the process to make it less profitable?
So that's a great question, right? I found it heartening that in fact their success rate is so low, and I found it interesting that so much of it gets squashed even as they try to send. So it makes me wonder about getting, the efficacy of that, the blacklisting is really quite strong, whether that can be pushed further so the advertisements don't go out in the first place. But I don't know. In part, I really wish we had more visibility into that middle part. How much does the user actually see? Now, if we took the numbers from the big email providers, then the conversion rates start getting kind of scary, that maybe 1 in 100 or 1 in 250 people who see it follow. And that could really drive up their profit.
So, Vern, do you have any idea how many of those 28 were actually other researchers trying to figure out what's going on with spam? Yeah,
that's a question. As I said, we filter out the crawlers. If you look at their countries, the visitors come from all over the world. And in fact, we looked for some sort of, is it more a third world effect or first world or Europe or Asia or whatever. It was hard to find something there. But they really do come from all over. And my mental model is there aren't researchers scattered, in the Philippines who are going to be doing this. I could be wrong. I don't know. To do that, we'd have to take the purchase.
So you mentioned that things were looking dicier for researchers now that there are criminals driving the activity for monetary reasons. What do the criminals have that the researchers don't have?
Oh, just numbers. They've got a market. They can go out and buy stuff they need. They can go out and buy the bots. So for us, our constraints are, there are a lot more of them thinking about innovation than us, and they're more serious about innovation now. So now, I think the typical researcher is a lot better at figuring out innovation, but there are a lot fewer of us. We also have significant restrictions in terms of legality and privacy that they don't have to honor. So can we get a bunch of bots? No, it's illegal. And so, some things we might try to do, like deeply infiltrate them or use their own bots to attack other botnets and stuff. It's just not even in the cards.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there. Let's thank Vern again.